And we're live. The cactuses, the colonnade, the cannonade of cactuses has assembled to defend Greenland. It is Wednesday.
Can you imagine cacti in Greenland? They're gonna last like 5 seconds.
Yeah, they're gonna like freeze to death.
Yeah.
It is Wednesday, January 21st, year of our Lord, such as it is, our godless year,
The year of our Lord.
2026. Yeah, exactly.
The year of Satan.
It is the year of Satan 2026. It is 8:00 a.m. And before I get started, because I'm going to forget if I don't say it up front, I want to invite everybody who may be joining this to a virtual event that I will be. It's also an in-person event, but I assume a lot of you are not mobile enough to get to the Middle East Institute by 10 o'clock this morning. At the Middle East Institute, the very estimable Charles Lister and I will be hosting Elizabeth Tsurkoff, the Princeton scholar who was recently released by Khatib Hezbollah in Iraq after being held hostage there for 2 years. We will be doing a conversation with Liz about her experience, about the Iranian-backed militias that held her, about U.S. hostage policy, and about other stuff such as it may come up. If you go to the MEI website, there is a registration both for the in-person event and for the virtual side of the event. I, as many of you know, I have become close over the 2 years of the of Elizabeth's captivity, have become close to the Tsurkoff family. Ironically, Liz and I have never met in person. That's one of the things about being held hostage, is that you don't actually get to meet people in person. So we had corresponded a bit during prior to her capture, mostly in Twitter DMs back when I was still on Twitter, and we've been in very close touch since her release. But I have this it's a weird experience. This will actually be the first time I have ever met her, though I have met all 3 of her siblings, and in fact did a special military operation about her directed against the Willard Hotel when the Iraqi prime minister was staying there. So this is going to be the first time I will have ever met Liz, and it is also the first time I have ever met a person who is the individual subject of a special military operation. So big day for me, but more importantly, it should be a very interesting event, and I want you all, if you are inclined to join, I am being paged by our guest today. Give me just a second. Holly, why don't you introduce the subject of the day while I'm
just going to do the cacti, and then I'm going to introduce the subject of the day.
Okay.
So, all right, let's see here.
You're watching Dog Shirt TV, a forking revolution in morning television.
You are watching Dog Shirt. Oh, go ahead. You do it.
You are watching Dog Shirt TV, and it is a forking revolution in morning television. And one of those revolutions is that the guest is texting right as they're maybe coming on, and we don't know if they're coming on.
No, she's coming on, but I just didn't
Oh,
send her a link, and
oh,
she
we
uses
don't send
good.
the guest the link ahead of time. That's a revolution because other shows would have a
Would have
producer
a
or like a
producer to
page to
do
do
that.
that. We don't have
Yeah.
any of those.
Well,
Anyway,
and
that's
also I did
all.
this guest is the same guest as recently, so I assumed she still had the link, but she uses good internet communications hygiene, so our signal texts have purged. So, it's one of the revolutionary features is that we don't really know what the fuck we're doing.
That's clear on a daily basis. So yes, all of that is a long-winded way of saying we are definitely not allowed to have fun anymore, because we are ruled by a pathic maniac who has destroyed the world order, that has largely kept the developed world's peace, for the past 80 years. And that is not fun. I am not having fun at all. But we are allowed to have Ari Tabatabai, who I was not on the show with before, but was very interesting, talking about Iran. But I'm told today Ari is actually has broad expertise and is prepared to talk about World War III. No big deal.
Yeah, so
No
let
big
me
deal.
first of all, let me introduce the two of you. Holly Berkley Fletcher, mischief maker, longtime CIA Africa analyst,
No longer. No
no
longer.
longer, although I want the record to reflect she outed herself
I did.
as an Africa analyst at
Um,
CIA on this show while still employed by the CIA
my
on her
last day.
last day in office. And of course, Ari Tabatabai, who presented herself on this show 2 or 3 days ago for her Iran expertise. But here's the thing about Ari, she actually works on other issues as well, and is currently mostly not working on Iran issues, working on a long series of articles for Lawfare about Greenland and NATO. And so I thought this morning when Holly said that we should talk about the disrupt what the Canadian Prime Minister calls a
No, he
disruption,
called it a
a
rupture. It's not a
rupture in the
disruption.
world
It's a
order.
rupture.
I thought, who should I text to say,
Are you up?
yeah, to say, are you awake? And
She looks like she's even dressed, unlike myself, which I'm never
I
dressed on this show. It's my thing now. I will never come. I will, well, okay. On occasion, I might come dressed, but you look like you are wearing real clothes.
I was gonna say I would love to say I dressed up for you guys, but I'm already out and about. As I was telling Ben, I was actually starting my edits on the pieces he mentioned, so I'm up and ready to go.
yeah, so all right, let's start with the fact, and this is the subject of my The Situation column yesterday. Let's start with the what Kamala Harris might call the root cause of the problem, which is that the president is deranged. And I think if anybody were in doubt on that point, the text that he sent to the Norwegian prime minister over the weekend resolves the issue decisively. It strikes me as so outside the bounds of what somebody with a semi-normal psychology would do. Um, and I want to flag three aspects of it for discussion that I think really raise a question about this is a person with massive power to disrupt the world order. And he said three things in that, which there are other things that are crazy, but there are three things that are really, really barking mad. So the first is that he explicitly links the fact that he did not win a Nobel Prize for peace. I note that he didn't win one for chemistry or literature either, but he doesn't seem worried about that. Um, he explicitly links that to the fact that he now wants Denmark to cede Greenland. And that he's entitled to pursue Greenland because Norway, which is not the same country as Denmark, by the way, and in any event does not control the Nobel Committee, did not give him a Nobel Peace Prize. The second thing is that he says in it explicitly, because of that, he does not feel the need to think exclusively about peace anymore, which does seem to be like, you didn't give me a prize, so I'm going to create war. I mean, it doesn't quite say that, but it's not saying that either. And then the third thing is this deranged discussion at the bottom, which looks a little bit like he lifted it out of Henry V, but then didn't understand the legal argument in Henry V for the claim on that Denmark's claim on Greenland is just that some boats landed there, a few hundred years ago, and
sounds vaguely familiar.
Yeah,
Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Actually, that was Spain even. Anyway, it has some familiar. It was around the same time. It's just kind of familiar. I don't know where I'm going.
It does have a weird pot calling the kettle black thing. Some guys wandered west, and that's their claim to our claim to Colorado or something. So, I read this and I said, nobody can think this person is sane. And it really, I mean, I've had a lot of experiences like that over the 9 years that he's been in my consciousness, but this one is somehow a little bit different, partly because it is ripping the world order apart. So, Ari, I want to start just by asking you, how bad is this situation right now with, the president taunting the Europeans ahead of Davos? And, are people overreacting to this?
No, but I do think it is really bad. And I want to add two actually other factors to what you've been describing. There is the president himself, but we also have an inactive Congress, and there is some musings coming out of the Hill with folks saying, listen, if the president were to take over Greenland, then we would be moving forward with impeachment articles. Great. But when US forces start landing in Greenland, it's already too late. In fact, it's already starting to be too late. And we can talk about some of the things we're seeing coming out of Europe in a bit. I'm sure we will touch on some of those things. I do think we're already on the trajectory of the damage is being done. And unless somebody is here to provide those checks and balances, I don't know if there's balances to be had, but at least some checks, some guardrails, we are going to be really shooting ourselves in the foot. And then number two, it's been really outstanding to me that no one in the administration has actually resigned, not a cabinet member, not a political at a lower level that I know of. And I keep thinking to myself, if this had happened in a different administration, people would be leaving. Mass exodus would be seen, and we're not seeing any of that. But to go back to your question, I do think that we're already seeing the damage done. Europeans, obviously are threatening tariffs. There's political steps that are being taken. The pieces you mentioned that I'm working on with my co-author, John Drennan from CFR, is going to lay out all of the political, military, and intelligence drawbacks of this move. And I'm deeply concerned that, we are at a time when we should all be focused on ending the war in Ukraine. at a time when we should be focused on a priority that multiple administrations in a row, including the first Trump administration, said we should be focused on, which is, the threats from China. That we should be thinking about kind of stabilizing the Middle East. We are focused on basically going after our own allies, and they have to then shift their attention to trying to figure out how to respond to this threat from within, which, by the way, NATO was not set up to deal with, right? NATO was not set up to deal with the threat of the prominent ally going after smaller allies. It was set up to deal with the threat from Russia, and we're not doing any of this. Another piece that we're working on is basically looking at what Russia might be taking away from all of this, how it might be benefiting from all of this. I think if you're Russia, if you're China, if you're Iran, if you're the DPRK, you're looking at the situation right now and thinking to yourself, okay, great, we have a declining America, declining Europe, and tensions within the alliance, and complete disarray and lack of attention on anything that is happening there. And by the way, at a time when we keep hearing about this kind of increased cooperation between these adversaries, right? They are working more and more together, and they're working together more and more closely. And we are starting to chip away at the thing that has actually made us safe and secure for 70 years at this point.
Okay, so I want to start with some basics, which is, it seems to me Trump looks at Greenland and says, it's really big. And with it, the United States would be bigger. And there's a bit of small penis syndrome going on here, and I think with Greenland, the United States would be bigger than Canada, and that would be good. And I am Donald Trump, and I want to be the one to make us bigger, because though I'm sure he couldn't identify Mr. Seward, he does have a sense that we got bigger when we bought Alaska. And so he looks at Greenland and says, I want to buy it, or I want to conquer it, and we'd be bigger. It's a very 19th century sense of grandeur and grandiosity. But that's not the vocabulary of it. The vocabulary of it is that we need it for national security. And so, which of course is silly, because the Danes have said, we'll work with you to do anything you want with respect to the security issues around Greenland. What are the security issues around Greenland? Are they real at all? And is there anything that is real that cannot be achieved by Danish-American security cooperation with respect to Greenland?
I can start, and then Holly, you should jump in here. I think the main kind of rationale that the administration has laid out about this is that we're seeing growing activities by Russia and China in the Arctic. And if we have access to Greenland, we'll be able to push back on that more effectively. I am willing to buy the premise that there is growing Russian and Chinese interest in the Arctic, and they have been increasing their capabilities and they've been increasing their activities there. I do not believe the premise that that is the reason why we need Greenland, because that to me is actually, if you're worried about Russian-Chinese cooperation or increased activities anywhere in the world, what you should be focusing on is actually interoperability with allies, intelligence sharing with allies, all of which are going to be part of the trade-offs that we're having to face here as the administration keeps kind of threatening, European allies, by the way, also Canada and other countries, right? Like, no country is going to be wanting to do increased intelligence sharing with us, to buy our assets, to increase interoperability, to send their forces, their personnel to our schools and vice versa if we keep saying, and if we're at the end of the day an adversary, which I think, for many Americans, I don't think we've really fully internalized this, that we are not seen as an ally anymore in Europe. We're increasingly not even just seen as a threat, we're increasingly seen as an adversary. And look, the United States does not have all of the exchanges that I was laying out with Russia and China for a reason. Why would countries that see us as an adversary do those things? So what we should be doing, if we believe the premise, again, as I do, that Russia and China are doing more in the Arctic and we should be addressing this, is we should be working with allies and include, especially Nordic allies, using their capabilities that they already have, using the resources that we're willing to put together, using the intel that we can all share together, and we should be driving toward that goal together. Now, the administration might say something to the effect of, look, we've been trying to work with the allies to get them to take this threat seriously. Yeah, that takes work. It takes time, right? You don't, in a lot of different situations, Holly, I'm sure you've experienced this in government as well. Allies don't always see eye to eye with you on everything. It takes time, it takes trust, it takes work, it takes intel sharing to be able to get them on board. But you have to do that work because ultimately you're better off facing those challenges together than you are doing it alone.
Holly, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, by his logic, we should just go ahead and roll into Latvia and Poland and all of the other, Eastern European nations that the Soviet Union is menacing, just preempt to defend them. It's like, it doesn't make any sense. It's like, well, I'm afraid the bad guys are going to come, so I'm going to become an alternative bad guy. It's just, I mean, the bottom line is nothing in the Trump era is that difficult. The man is a sociopath. His psychology is abnormal. It's all about him and his personal needs. Sociopaths, by the way, will blow things up just because they like the look of the explosion. They like the entertainment of the explosion. They don't even have to have a need. They just like to wreck things, just to for the interest of it. They get bored very easily, and just for the interest of it, they like to just blow things up. They like to, and then it's entertainment for them, but it's also they like to see. Someone said earlier, or in the chat with Alicia, we were saying, well, Trump, at least Trump will hear people say bad things about them. No, all attention is good. They love all attention. They love control. They love to see people scurry around because they love to see their foot come down and the earth shake. That's fun for them. They like control. They like to menace. That's what they do. Not everything in the Trump era, even his economic policy, is based on his sociopathy because they don't understand trust. They don't understand relationship. They don't understand partnership. They don't understand love. And free trade is basically about trusting, I'm going to do this, and then we're going to trade freely because I trust that you're not going to screw me over. And he doesn't understand that. He doesn't understand democracy because that's also based on trust. I'm going to make my case. I'm going to try to use persuasion, and then I'm going to win the hearts and minds of the vote. He doesn't understand any of this. And so it's the repercussions are complicated and complex, but the cause is very basic. And it is astounding to me that 10 years in, people, particularly in the Republican Party, do not understand what is going on. This is a classic historical, on a historic level, madman of history that has taken over our country. And wake up. And can I just say, sorry, I'm a bit on a rant, Ari, but the very worst thing that the Europeans could do right now is to appease him in any way and give in any way. And I realize the risk for them is great. But here's the thing. Again, we saw this. Please remember Munich in 1934. Now, if we appease him now, he's old. He's probably not going to go invade a bunch of other countries. You know, he has only a certain number of years left in his life, and I'm not sure his overall project is that truly invested in this kind of thing. But here's the thing: the more the Europeans appease him, the longer the United States and American voters will not pay the price of their actions, and there needs to be pain because nothing else is getting through to the American people. And so ideally, before the midterm elections, and certainly before the 2028 elections, although he could screw around with things, we need to have real pain here. And Europe and Canada and some of these other countries are in a position to at least try to inflict some consequences of our actions. And if they care anything about democracy and the future of democracy, they must stand up to him, and they must show the American people what the consequences are for authoritarianism. And I will end my rant there.
So
Can I just
go ahead, Ari.
Can I just jump in to say to Holly's point about, basically how the American people are seeing all this? Some of the polling is indicating that the majority are kind of understand that this is not the right kind of course of action, right? However, there's still solidly about a third of the population that doesn't see this as completely insane and that supports the president's ambitions to go after Greenland and probably other places. And that to me is really problematic. And to me, it means that the rest of us need to do some work here and need to be able to, I don't know that we're going to move everyone, but we are not doing enough to articulate the reasons why this doesn't make any sense, the reasons why these alliances matter, the things that we actually get out of these alliances and NATO specifically, and so on and so forth. And that to me has been kind of disheartening a little bit to see that there is still a third of the population that is like, yeah, sure, we should go after an ally's, territory.
It's true, although I was encouraged to see that number falls to 13 or 14% when it comes to military action to seize Greenland, which, at least acknowledges. I think, Ted Cruz was on television the other day defending the desire to acquire Greenland, but I'm not sure he would defend, a military seizure of Greenland, although he might. I don't want to put it past him. There does seem to be a gap between those two groups. So let's talk about remedies here, because this was the subject of my column yesterday, and I honestly didn't find my own answer to it satisfying, and that's probably because I don't think there is a satisfying answer. But, on the one hand, you have the impeachment clause, which is useless because it requires 2/3 of the Senate to concur, and that is just not going to happen. The other thing about the impeachment provisions is that they're slow. They don't, it's not like, you have a vote of no confidence and the government falls and Donald Trump turns into a pumpkin. Then you have the 25th Amendment, which is everybody trots out as a good remedy, but it's even worse because it requires a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress. And it also requires J.D. Vance to stab Trump in the back, which would require J.D. Vance to have something like political courage, which is precisely what his entire career has demonstrated that he doesn't have. And beyond that, within the United States, your only remedies are congressional fortitude, which is building a little bit, but not at the levels that would be really meaningful. Elections, which are at a minimum 9 months off, and then are likely to flip at most only one house, not both. And random death, which, just to be clear, is a discussion of natural causes here, not anything like a discussion of assassination. But you could imagine the cheeseburger from hell ending this situation, act of God. None of those strike me as plausible remedies, particularly in the short term, that we can count on. And that makes me very interested in international diplomatic remedies. And so my question is, Holly says, don't capitulate to him, don't appease him. I think that's obviously right. But what tools does Europe have, either individually, as individual countries, or as a collective, to restrain him? Are there tools that aren't being used here that should be on the table?
I'm happy to start and then see what Polly has to add. Yeah, I mean, there's a spectrum of things that the Europeans can do, and while I agree that they should do a lot, I do think that some of the things on that spectrum can be deeply damaging to, and potentially to the point of no return for the alliance more generally. So I'm of two minds, in that they should be taking actions to at least provide some of those, again, checks and guardrails. But on the other hand, I worry that if they do, that we might not come back from this easily. But I think we're not coming back from this easily anyway. So, we started talking a little bit about political statements, political pressure, the kind of back channel diplomacy that Macron and co are trying to do here, all the text messages that we're seeing leaked to the press. So that's kind of on one end of the spectrum. Then you have the economic tools, right? The tariffs and so on and so forth. Canada, a while ago, and I think it's back on the table, had talked about specifically going after red states, which I thought was actually a very smart and good understanding of, what might move the needle here, and not kind of, make Canada be the bad guy in the eyes of, many Americans who oppose what the president and the administration are trying to do. Then we move to things that, again, are more the bread and butter of NATO. So there's already discussions, Canada being one example, but other countries too, that they're not going to purchase US defense equipment, weapons, and assets. The F-35 is one of the things that's been floated around. Canada was supposed to buy 88 of those. Those are really expensive things. It's like 100 million per F-35. And then there's a long trail of maintenance and kind of training and all the things that go with it that are also part of, by the way, the economy, right? Like the F-35 is assembled in Texas, but it's built, its components and suppliers are throughout the country. It creates many jobs. And that's just one asset that we're talking about. But again, if you're a European country, if you're Canada, why would you buy US assets that could be used against you down the line if the United States were to try to threaten you again? So they can stop purchasing our defense equipment and weapons and platforms and so on and so forth. The next thing they can do is, again, kind of like stop sharing information with us. And that is going to be deeply damaging. That is not a visible thing that most people kind of like know, what sort of information sharing occurs right. But that is a critical thing from the perspective of national security, counterterrorism, weapons proliferation, you name it. We rely on intelligence from our friends and allies to be able to go after those things. And then there's the really drastic things that the Europeans can do. And if they go that way, we are really, we're not going to have a good day. And that is essentially ending some of the agreements that we have with them to use their territories for various things, a whole host of military and intelligence things. And again, that is a much more drastic thing to do. And I'm not sure that they're there yet, and they should really think very carefully, obviously, and weigh the pros and cons and trade-offs if they decide to go in that direction. I hope we don't get to that. But I think that many people just don't know how many benefits we get from just having access to all these bases around the world. We often talk about alliances as underpinning national security. That is very true. But the other thing that also underpins national security since the end of World War II is that we have access to dozens of countries that allow our forces, our folks to go in and out, to use it for, to counter threats elsewhere. And if we don't have that network of bases overseas, we're going to have to do things in a much more expensive way, in a much more logistically challenging way, and we're going to add time to it.
Yes. Sorry, go ahead, Holly.
Yeah, a couple. I think that was a great rundown. The problem is, of course, that this is like turning the Titanic. Everything's been so built on this system and these assumptions for so long that to shift is not something you can do overnight. I think the basing is, that's really important. They could also they could crack down on American travelers. They could impose visas on American travelers. They could make it expensive if they want. Right now, you don't need a visa to go to Europe. They could impose some sort of visas. They could, again, a lot of Americans, a lot of Trump supporters like to go on summer vacation in Europe. They could make that difficult. But a lot of these things are this realignment, you can't do that, the economic things, and you can't do that overnight. I think Canada's been as quick as possible. You hate to see Canada, form agreements with China, but under the circumstances, and I thought Carney's speech, explained this really well. They don't have any choice. They're, as he calls them, they're a middle power. They are not a superpower, and he has to do what's best for Canada.
So tell us about Carney's speech, Holly, for those who haven't read it like me.
Well, he gave a speech yesterday in Davos, and it's not a long speech. You can read the whole thing. But he basically lays out very clearly, and I'm not the details will probably escape me. He calls what's going on, it's not a transition. He explicitly says it is not a transition. It's not even a disruption. It is a rupture. It is a rupture. He makes it very clear. And he basically argues that, Europe and Canada and, all of these countries along, after World War II made this bargain, which sometimes was uncomfortable. He talks about how, the U.S. hasn't always pursued common ideals in a way that upholds common values, and sometimes, Europe and Canada has been sort of compromised in terms of its own values and morality by this bargain with the United States. But nonetheless, overall, he says it has kept the peace, and it's created economic growth and activity, and there's been the most benefits for a large number of people through this. And he basically says that's over, and you can't operate on the assumption that it's coming back. You have to go forward. And he says, Canada and other middle powers have to find new alliances and realign. And so Canada is certainly doing that with China. But he basically paints a portrait. Also, yesterday, or the day before, this week, there was a very long article in The Atlantic by Robert Kagan that goes into more depth and basically what Carney said, which is we're going into a world of multipolarity.
And Bob Kagan, just so that you guys know, does not do interviews, broadcasts of any kind ever. So we cannot have him on Dog Shirt TV. Otherwise, I would text him and say, Bob, come on the show, but he doesn't do that.
When you reach a certain level, I guess that's you can live.
Yeah, he floats above.
That's
he
right.
Occasionally descends to the level of Earth to impart wisdom to mortals, and then he reascends to Olympus. No, Bob is a super, super lovely guy, and
The article
I
is
adore
scary.
him.
So both Carney and Kagan paint this picture of and JVL, and he quotes Kagan in his triad yesterday on the Bulwark. But this multipolar world where it's just a a sort of a cutthroat competition between a bunch of middle powers, and actually that creates more conflict. It creates more poverty. It creates all the bad things that we don't want. And so, it's kind of counterintuitive. You think that, like, I hear a lot of my sort of lefty friends talk about American empire and how it's like so terrible. And it's like, we've sometimes acted against our values and in not a moral way, that's for sure. But again, since World War II, and our allies back us up, it's been generally, when we've had a superpower, us, that generally often operates against its own interest for the broader benefit of the world. I think that, and the last 80 years in terms of economic growth and global prosperity and peace, at least in the developed world, the developing world is a whole nother story. And America doesn't acquit itself there. But at least with regards to the developed world, it has produced, but even for the developing world, global poverty has been cut by 60% over the last 80 years. It's been a benefit to the world. And so it's counterintuitive to think like, oh, ending the might of a superpower is bad for the world, but it actually is going to be. It's going to lead to nuclear rearmament by multiple different countries, and we're going to have because they all have that at this point. Pretty much everybody has the technology.
Right.
They can do it if they want. These are not secret, secret codes anymore, or like secret processes. Everybody can have a nuclear weapon if they want. They've chosen not to for the peace of the world. And so we're exiting all of that. And it's very, very scary. And to me, it is hard to wrap my mind around just thinking about, I always get back to the voters, It's like, we chose this. This is our fault. Like, in fact, I'm going to write a bit of a sarcastic piece on my Substack later this week to all the people that are offended by my, activism. But I can't wrap my mind around the fact that people have basically allowed he's not been he tried to overthrow our own democratic system here at home. Like, it's been very clear what a terrible person he is, and then how he echoes history. And they just thought, like, oh, like, how bad can it be? My eggs are expensive. Or like, if you're evangelical, like, oh, like, there are too many trans people. Like there's 8 trans athletes in girls sports at any level that matters in the United States, and you're gonna like blow up the entire world because you don't like 8 trans people. Like, I just can't even wrap my mind around it. It's very upsetting. And I had another point, but obviously I've completely lost it because I've lost it. Like, I'm just so upset.
Can I piggyback on the nuclear point though? Because, Ben, you started the conversation with basically like, how bad can this be? And thank you for bringing up the nuclear piece, which is that, like, if you go back to the 1960s, people assumed that there would be dozens of nuclear weapons states around the world by now. And that didn't happen. And a big part of it is because the United States was willing to give assurances and security guarantees to friends, and was then able to use the coalitions that it was building against adversaries, as we did with Iran, for example, and North Korea, although not particularly successfully there, to prevent nuclear proliferation. And now, if you're taking away the stability and predictability of the United States as a power, and saying, listen, our security guarantees don't mean anything, and by the way, like, we're going to flip-flop on Ukraine, and then we might actually threaten you and go after your territory, why would more countries not acquire their own nuclear weapons? And
Right.
if that were to happen, the United States is not equipped to deal with that. Like, we are not, we would have to do some really big rethinking to be able to handle and deal with a world where you have dozens of nuclear weapon states, And I just cannot even imagine what that would look like. But I don't, again, I think that is one of the threats and implications that the administration is not taking seriously. It is clearly not thinking about what the worst case scenario would look like here and what it would do if all of a sudden, Sweden, where there are already conversations about, hey, we joined NATO because we thought that was going to help our security, but now maybe it won't. Maybe we should be looking at a nuclear weapon. What if they started to actually do that? What if the South Koreans decided that they're going to get a nuclear weapon? Like, how are we going to deal with
Japan, for
all of those
sure.
things?
I mean,
Japan for sure, which actually has the capability to your point,
absolutely.
to do that,
Yeah.
right? They do have the pathways that are open. So a lot of the reason why countries haven't done it and have withheld from it so far is because we've had this understanding for decades that they don't need to do it because we're here to support them. That's partially why we have bases places. That's why we park our capabilities in different countries. And we're in the, space of exactly a year now, we've managed to undo so much of that work that was done over the course of decades by generations of people to bring that stability and security.
I have a
All right.
question for Ari, if you don't mind, Ben. And I
No, go
remember
ahead.
my earlier point. So, Ari, I wonder if you could. My question is the impact of all this on the developing world, which has obviously, certainly Africa, has seen less of a benefit, obviously, from the superpower model of America. And in fact, you could obviously the United States in back in Cold War history was a destructive force, certainly in Africa as it tried to counter Russia. It was not a rapacious force. It wasn't going in there to take all. That's a myth. But it certainly in trying to outmaneuver the Soviet Union in Africa, it certainly caused a whole lot of damage. And then in more recent years, you could argue that when it has gone into Africa, it hasn't worked out. But you could actually argue that limited American influence in Africa actually has been to the detriment of Africa. So I wonder if you could comment on what the impact this might have on, say, Africa or the more I know Asia is a little bit different, but the more developing world.
I think you might be better. This might be a better question for you than it is for me. I think there are, at least sort of operationally, I think there are going to be, again, implications if the Europeans start to pull back on some of the accesses that they've given us, some of the information sharing they've given us. As Holly, you know better than I do, like, the French have so much better access and understanding of a lot of things that are going on in Africa, right?
Used to.
That's true.
Already
They have
pulled
been.
back quite a bit. Yeah.
That's true. They've been kicked out by many countries there, but they still do have access. They still have knowledge that we don't necessarily have from decades and decades of very problematic history, to be clear, but history nonetheless. So, we've relied on those relationships to be able to, for example, get after terrorism threats. And if all of a sudden we don't have that relationship, and we don't have a basis to operate out of. Again, I think this is just way out in the future, but if that were to happen, I think we would see our ability to counter those threats there diminished, and then that in turn we would have to deal with the consequences at home, right? Because, like, if you don't stop terrorism somewhere, it pops up somewhere else, and often it can pop up at home, and you don't want that. So I think that is going to be deeply challenging. The second thing, on a more kind of like strategic level, again, for now 10 plus years, many administrations have said, we want to compete with China. And they've said, although this administration in its second form doesn't seem to care that much about competing with China, but some in the administration do, I guess. Most don't seem to, and the president doesn't seem to. But one of the places where we've talked a lot about competing with China has been the Global South, and Africa has been a big part of that. And again, if we're not able to work with allies in concert, then we're ceding the ground. This is one benefit that we've had that China hasn't had, that Russia hasn't had, which is to be able to not just have the power and the resources and the capabilities of a single country, a big one and a very powerful one, but nonetheless, but to have that of dozens of countries, right? And so we are really just kind of like given up a major capability, a major advantage that we've had for nothing. But I would love to hear from, because you know Africa a lot better than I do. I actually don't
It's
at
a
all.
tricky question because again, American, obviously we've already seen the impact of the, you know, wiping out of American aid, and the entire aid structure was already diminishing before the end of U.S. aid. In fact, the Europeans have been reducing their aid footprint for a while now, and the U.S. increasingly was holding up that structure. So, I mean, in the short term, you know, in the short medium term, the cessation of aid is just devastating. But in the longer term, it could be beneficial. You know, many critics of aid, you know, the aid industry, when it is an industry, is the we have, John, we've had, well, we haven't, but the world, Africa has seen the impact. So 600,000 people are already dead. So the American people don't know probably and don't care. But anyway, I was talking about Africa. So, but in the longer term, you know, the aid industry, there's many critics and there's many African critics who argue that it breeds dependency and it sort of lets their own governments off the hook. So there could be some longer term benefits of that. But I'm more thinking like security wise, sure. Although, again, if you're a critic, you could argue that some terrorism anyway in the Middle East and has been in reaction to a Western influence. So although I don't think that's as true in Africa, you know, Somalia, for instance, that's just, there's no Western presence in Somalia. But I'm more concerned about the economics because, you know, Africa, the world is interdependent, and Africa depends on how the developed world goes. You know, Africa is, you know, that brings investment to Africa, tourism, all of these things, and they depend on that. So if the developed world is less secure and less prosperous, there is a trickle down effect to the developing world that I can see. There could be, however, I'm trying to be optimistic and think that, like, okay, you know, maybe there could be, and then of course there's the absence of any sort of democratic advocacy, which has been the basis of U.S. policy since the end of the Cold War in Africa. And that's been Trump, that ended when Trump won as well. But, you know, I'm trying to be optimistic and try to think like, well, as the developing world just completely implodes and becomes, you know, a disaster, you know, maybe the future is going to be African. You know, like maybe Africa can finally get themselves together and sort of, again, the leftist argument that like Africa's problems are still colonialism and like rapacious Western powers coming in there and like taking all the raw minerals. That's just not true anymore. I'm sorry, it's just not. There needs to be more investment in Africa, and the Western powers don't go. The Western companies don't go in because it's not secure, and the reason it's not secure is because there's poor governance, and it's a bad deal. And so, Cold War politics and interference aside, like that's just not true anymore. And so, my fear is that my optimistic take has nowhere to go.
All right, we have got to wrap up a
Sorry,
little early today because I have got to get down to the Middle East Institute, see earlier discussion. But two things. The first is there is discussion in the chat yesterday about the bright spot in all of this, which is that Lindsay Halligan is no longer the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia. We are going to be discussing that saga
modeling
tomorrow on the show. With, I bet you can guess whom. The estimable Anna Bauer will be on the show, and we will be talking all things Lindsay Halligan. We may even send her a text or two. That'll be tomorrow. That's going to be a fun show. This is a super dark show. But one last question before we wrap up. Which is, there is this one other force that sometimes restrains Trump, and it is negative market reaction. And he got a bit of that yesterday. And I'm wondering whether, in your judgment, there is some interaction between European reaction and market reaction. You target red states, you announce you're not buying F-35s. Those are things that actually markets do react to. And I wonder if there is some, I wouldn't call it market manipulation, but policy announcements that European governments can make in iterative conversation with American markets that might be effective here.
Oh, who's that to?
That was to
Yeah.
Ari, who is
Oh,
muted. Oh,
good
not
God.
muted anymore.
No, I was just thinking this is way out of my depth. I think so. I don't have anything super coherent or intelligence to say about it. I think so though, but I mean I do think that that is actually one area where, the president has shown himself to be willing to kind of be maybe like his views have been shaped by the market in the past. It might actually be one thing that sways him because clearly again it's not security or intelligence or military things.
Right, but he
And more
really doesn't like when markets tank in response to things he does.
exactly. And I think as we get closer to the midterms and the whole affordability thing is still an issue for voters, and, he has this risk of losing ground, and he's clearly, he said publicly he's worried about impeachment, probably for himself and also for his cabinet members if the elections don't go his way. I think that will actually probably be the one thing that plays more of a role to shape his decision making than anything else we've talked about today.
Folks, we're going to leave it there. Ari, thank you for joining us on very short notice from a cafe. Holly, Berkley, Fletcher, always great to see you in a bad mood in the morning, holding your head like Holly is like the Edvard Munch painting, engraving. Yeah, there we go. Oh, we need
all
that.
are. We all are.
We need a screenshot of that, guys. We're going to be back tomorrow. We're going to have Anna Bauer. We're going to be talking long-haired Lindsay Halligan plans, interactions with judges. It's gonna be fun. We're gonna send texts. We're gonna if you have not seen the statement she issued to I can't remember if it was Kyle Cheney or somebody else yesterday. It is a thing of beauty. That's going to be tomorrow. We got to get through today first. The president is speaking at Davos. Hold on to your seats. Pour yourself a really stiff drink. And
Let's all do it together. 1, 2, 3.
There we go. That'll be tomorrow. I was going to say, I don't know who the co-hosts are going to be, except I suspect Holly's going to be there. I do know who the guest is going to be. You're going to be there.
Take me for granted now.
No, because you always show up. You're going to be there. I'm going to be there. It's going to be a blast in a weird sort of way.
Less promiscuous